So in Classroom of the Elite, Ayanokoji just changed everything and nothing will ever be the same again. Now, Ayanokoji's father once said that having power and refusing to use it is something only a fool would do. And that's what Ayanokoji did. He played the fool throughout his time in the Advanced Nurturing High School as a member of Class D. And after overcoming the trials and tribulations of their first 2 years, rejected as defects in Class D, Horikita's class has done the impossible by ascending to 3rd year Class A. It's a significant milestone, an achievement that has never been done before, and logically, this is something that should set the stage for the final year. After all the struggle, the sacrifices and pain, Horikita's class should feel triumph and victory, but instead there's just confusion, and that's because their greatest key figure, the person pulling the strings from behind the scenes, and the true mastermind of Horikita's class, Kiyotaka Ayanokoji, did the unthinkable and betrayed his class. The genius playing the fool has become the Joker, and nobody understands why.
In the 1960s, a Swiss zoologist named Adolf Portman proposed the theory that all humans were born premature. Naturally, a newborn can't walk on its own. It has to learn by trying and failing. Horikita is the same way. But that same underdeveloped nature doubles as the capacity for infinite potential.
Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty, there's a certain magnitude to what Ayanokoji has done that needs to be emphasized before diving in and exploring every other major event that transpired in 3rd year Volume 1. From the outside looking in, from the perspective of everyone who isn't Ayanokoji, with the exception of possibly Koenji, what Kiyotaka just did doesn't make any sense. Like, he spent all this time assisting Horikita, playing these games of manipulation, and slowly rising the ranks until Class A was theirs. That's the entire goal of the school. That's why there's these special exams, and the entire system structured around class points. And Ayanokoji simply discarded it like it was nothing, just like his class. Now obviously, we know why. He never planned or cared to graduate from Class A. His future is all but assured in accordance with his father's wishes. And Kiyo has his own plans for the mark he intends to leave in the Advanced Nurturing High School. But this information is only privy to us because we're the reader, so only we can see the dramatic irony of this whole situation. But to any outsider or student, Ayanokoji made the most illogical decision, and a theme that's present throughout this volume is the question of why did Ayanokoji transfer out of Class A to Class C and replace Sakiyanagi as the leader. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's reset to the lens of our actual protagonist of the 3rd year, who's now coming to terms with this awful future.
If you're truly serious about advancing to Class A, then allow me to offer you a simple word of advice. Learn as much about Ayanokoji as you can.
Now, Horikita moves forward into her 3rd year with optimism and excitement. She reflects on the turbulent past 2 years and is humbly amazed that her goal of reaching Class A has become reality. She thinks about Ayanokoji, who's become this significant presence in her life, the primary driving force of her growth and strength. She's even looking forward to spending another 2 years together as desk neighbors. If only she knew. He's someone so important to her current identity. It's almost hard to imagine what it would be like if he wasn't there anymore. And that's the tragedy that will befall Horikita. She no longer has to imagine such a cruel reality. She gets to live and savor every ounce of it. First, Pseudo's curiosity brings forth the ominous question, asking where is Ayanokoji, and stating that he hasn't seen him since the opening ceremony. Horikita thinks it's strange, remarking on her own brief interaction earlier that day, where everything seemed normal, but now something doesn't feel right, like there's a pit in her stomach. Pseudo attempts to rationalize that maybe he's avoiding class because of Kadoizawa. They're trying to understand what's going on, because why else would Ayanokoji be absent on the first day? Chabashira entering the room sets the whole tone for this situation. She's in shock, shaken, speechless. She has no words to deliver this difficult message, and she can barely understand the circumstance for what it is herself. The class thinks she's sick because they've never seen their teacher in this state before, but as Chabashira struggles, she finally gets the words out that Ayanokoji had exercised his right to transfer classes. The class thinks she's joking. They can't believe such an outrageous thing, but slowly it unravels. They check the class roster, see that his name isn't there, and Horikita feels sick to her stomach. Horikita's heart rate increases. The class is overloading Chabashira with questions, and the crash shouts begin, because those who know about Ayanokoji's abilities are totally freaking out. Those who don't know, well, that realization will happen later. Koenji, He doesn't care. This doesn't affect him. But the two people suffering the most from this news are Kei Karuizawa and Suzune Horikita, the two people who were arguably the closest to Kiyotaka. The greatest asset of Class A has just become their greatest weakness. It's a crazy transformation.
Why do you imagine Ayanokoji would be going out of his way to help the rest of you? And why, despite his superiority, does he refuse to reveal what he's capable of?
Now, Horikita obviously needs some answers or some sort of confirmation for what just transpired. She's in severe denial. She's trembling and shaking, and she just wants to see Ayanokoji, but she's terrified to see him. It's a truly awful situation that she faces, and yet she still attempts to move forward. So as soon as class ends, she goes out to find him, disregarding everyone, and countless questions flood Horikita's mind. Did Ayanokoji actually betray his class? Was he sent as a spy, or was he even exiled? What's he thinking? And why did he do this to her? As the class leader, Horikita bears the weight of this burden. When she eventually confronts Ayanokoji, with Matsushita in tow because she has her own reasons for being there, Horikita's worst fears are finally realized. Ayanokoji is undeniably the enemy. To make matters worse, he barely regards or shows concerns for their emotional state. He shuts them down without revealing any of his intentions. So while trying to bring things to light, they're simply trapped in the darkness. And the big problem is that Ayanokoji was the core of their class. And in any type of battle, information is always the strongest weapon. And now all that data he's collected on Horikita's class will be used against them. Now I really gotta call it out, but considering the fact that he spent the last 2 years with this class, Ayanokoji is about as cold-blooded as they come. He effectively ghosted and blocked his class in real time. When they try to approach him to gauge his intentions, he just shuts them down and doesn't even give them the courtesy of an actual response. This is the sociopathic nature ingrained into Ayanokoji on full display, the savagery behind his actions, and the absent remorse or guilt he feels while he manipulates others to achieve his goals. Like, you actually gotta put this into perspective. He shows up for the first hour of class, goes to the opening ceremony with his current class, and just bounces without a word to anyone just so he could hurt them even more. And you could ask the question of why he would do such a thing to people he could very well consider his allies. But the truth is, Kiyotaka never saw any of them as his allies, just pawns in his game of manipulation. And with that context noted, it totally reframes the circumstance from Horikita's perspective. Ayanokoji is the enemy, a traitor and a villain. And the sooner that Horikita understands this, the better off she will be as she prepares for this uncertain future.
To put it in the school's terms, Class D is the place for those with defective qualities, the ones who barely had the chops to get in at all. It's just my opinion, so take it with a grain of salt. But out of everyone in Class 1D, the most effective student is Ayanokoji.
Now, Ayanokoji's situation isn't exactly simple. He can't just step into Class C and expect that he's automatically the leader. He knows there's going to be some level of pushback and hesitancy, and that's because people are suspicious of his motives and actions because, again, this is the guy that gave up Class A and no one does this. So regardless of the sunk cost fallacy of spending millions of private points for Ayanokoji's transfer, he still needs to prove his worth. And since he's been working in the shadows largely for the majority of his high school life, he's got to give them some results so they can be confident in their decision. After all, with his current class, he really only has 2 weapons that he can use at his disposal. Hashimoto, whose stock has crashed considerably considering his recent actions, and Morishita, who's, well, Morishita. But outside the scope of his class, Ayanokoji has someone else that he can rely on, and that's Ichinose. And my god, where to begin with Ichinose? Because the last time we saw her in action, she was making some crazy prehistoric discoveries with Ayanokoji and his T-Rex. But since her evolution throughout the spring break, and despite the fact that her class is objectively lagging behind in Class D, she's become a real force of nature. The current Ichinose is far more composed, daring, and honest. She's opened up, accepted, and controlled her own malice, and now she's in a position to bend the rules or walk across moral borders in order to succeed. Not to mention, she's utterly obsessed with Ayanokoji, and because of this understanding that they've cemented, and because of the credibility that Ichinose has established as a student and a friend to others, Class D and Class C have this crazy overpowered alliance that easily has the potential to equalize the class points. And that's because with this agreement, Ayanokoji is basically in control of 2 different classes. And so now that we understand both sides of this feud, we got this really interesting situation. You know, Ayanokoji did all these things, make this big spectacle where he transfers classes, betrayed and destroyed his old class, and more specifically broke Horikita, and it's all for Horikita. Ayanokoji's goal isn't to bring her down, but rather lead her and guide her to growth, which is pretty messed up when you think about everything, but we'll get to that later. Ayanokoji put Horikita through all the stress and pain, left all these deep emotional scars that would take a long time to heal, because just like in the island exam, or the sports festival where Horikita crashed and burned really hard, her failure is a stepping stone towards success. And so Ayanokoji believes that this time it will be her class that saves Horikita, allowing her to recover from this traumatic event that he actively instigated.
Kiyotaka, explain this to me. What in the world inspired you to come to this school?
You did, actually. You kept talking about how you gave us the ultimate education. So naturally, I took an interest in the worldly society that you rejected, to see it for myself.
Okay, so now breaking away from the consequences of Ayanokoji's actions, we can now move forward to the most integral themes that's being set up in this volume, and will likely become increasingly pervasive throughout the third year, and that's the perspective of the onlooker. To put it more clearly, it's this idea where the outsiders have the most clear viewpoint, because they can see things more objectively. Now, this sentiment is first brought to the table because of Shiraishi Asuka. That's right, we got another girl to add to Ayanokoji's harem, because bros collecting women like they're fucking, I don't know, Pokemon, gym badges, whatever it is. But anyways, Shiraishi is like this overall average student, but as we find out, she has strengths and values that numbers can't calculate. She's this devious seductress, a wolf in sheepskin, and someone who's insanely perceptive, and so she drops this statement that doesn't seem too crazy at face value, but when you extrapolate, it means so much more. Shiraishi tells Ayanokoji that she believed he blended well into Class A's dynamic, as someone to be relied on. She has a very high opinion of Ayanokoji, which is strange because, well, most people don't. And you know, Ayanokoji rejects the notion, believing that he never thought he displayed such an attitude to other classes. But Shiraishi confirms that, from the outside, you can see a lot. It's an interesting statement because it showcases the fact that there are things that even Ayanokoji can miscalculate, or rather, since he was constantly on the outside looking in, it shows that that's how he was able to play these games of manipulation so easily. Because he was always in the shadows, and always had the perspective of the onlooker. That's why, as an outsider, he tended to have a better grasp on situations than the people involved. But now that Ayanokoji is 100% in the spotlight, it's going to be interesting to see how this affects him oppositely. And of course, not just Ayanokoji, but everyone else involved. Because eventually, a certain student will find out about Ayanokoji's past in full. And those on the inside of the White Room, you know, they revere Ayanokoji as this god. But from the outside looking in, it's easy to see the tragedy that surrounds his character, living in solitude, growing up without a mother or father, and suffering at the hand of so-called educators, just to craft the quote-unquote perfect human. Ayanokoji can't see the trauma that affects him, or more so, he's actively repressing it, which is why there's so many things from the White Room that he just can't remember. But once the truth is eventually revealed, only those closest to Kiyotaka will see the full picture. Now again, this doesn't just apply to Ayanokoji, but everyone else, which is how certain developments are able to blossom, like the bond that Horikita and Karuizawa end up creating through the shared loss of Ayanokoji. Then there's also Kushida becoming this potential spy in Class A, working for Ayanokoji, and even certain circumstances with Nanase that point to her being a White Room spy. But these are things that we will revisit later, as the mysteries begin to unravel.
The ultimate masterpiece of the White Room. Though as far as I'm concerned, you're nothing but a false genius. But don't worry, I'll make sure to bury you.
Well, you are welcome to try.
Okay, so now we get into the major event of this volume. That's right, it's special exam time, which almost always ends up with a crash at or two. It's a beautiful thing. Now, Kiyotaka is objectively in a pretty precarious position. He just turned a class of pawns and allies into enemies, and now he has to turn old enemies into allies. And with the academic-based special exam, this would become his first obstacle. Now, the comprehensive academic ability exam is pretty straightforward. It's a written exam composed of random questions from 21 topics across 7 different subjects, with a total of 100 questions. The competition between classes would be split into 2 different categories. The full class battles, where class members compete and the class with the highest total score wins. And then we got the small group battles, where each class chooses 5 representatives and each rep competes individually for the highest score. However, the small group battle also has certain exclusive rules that can change the nature of the game, with the existence of penalty points, which are points that can deduct the total score of any individual student competing. Each class starts with 100 points, and there's no limit limit to the number of penalty points that can be assigned, and classes can purchase additional points at the cost of 50,000 private points each. So let's say that one person gets 100% on the test, but the opposing class applies 100 penalty points to said person. Their score is effectively 0. Now the win cons are kind of obvious. You just have to win by getting the highest overall score, and with the reward being class points. This test is honestly the ideal way for classes to close the gap. It's perfect for Ayanokoji and Ichinose. To make matters better for Ayanokoji, his new class would be facing Ryuen's class, while Ichinose's would be battling Horikita's. And with Horikita's class still recovering from their loss, their situation does not look too great. But this particular situation is far more game-changing for Ayanokoji, and that's because his victory condition comes at the price of earning his class's trust. You see, the now reformed Class C and the previously established Class A always excelled at academics, so when they're facing Ryuen's class in a battle of wits, they're going to win 10 out of 10 times, even without Ayanokoji's intervention. And such worries were stated by Class 3C student Shimazaki, who voiced his concerns with a foreign entity taking over the class. What Class C needs in this current moment is a leader, someone who can show the most value even when victory is assured, and that's why it was collectively decided that in the small group battles, all Ayanokoji needs to do is predict Ryuen's selections, the students he will choose to write the exams, and those he will choose to target. If he can do that, he can earn the class's trust. And since he's the genius of the White Room, the perfect human, a local paleontologist with his, well, T-Rex, this should be no issue. It's easy, right? Well, not so much, because even as much as I like to glaze Kiyotaka, he is not an omnipotent god. Now Ryuen knows this, which is what makes him such a lethal force, because although he doesn't get the reason for why Ayanokoji would choose to switch classes, what he does understand is the fact that Kyo needs to earn his position as class leader. Just as Class C knows that they will win this exam, Ryuen knows that his class will lose 10 out of 10 times, regardless of Ayanokoji's presence. It's just reality. But a loss in this exam isn't a total loss. If he can defeat Ayanokoji in his game of manipulation and control, he can predict that eventually Class C would come to recognize Ayanokoji's abilities. But if he can negate that progress even just a little bit, it could effectively end Ayanokoji's future reign of terror and significantly impact their class's influence moving forward. Doing his due diligence, Ryuen discovers how Ayanokoji expects to tackle this exam, making these arbitrary predictions. And so Ryuen does something that shows a real level of character growth in his part. Rather than simply relying on violence or rushing headstrong into an exam without a structured plan, he develops a strategy to directly counter Ayanokoji. He checks off all potential possibilities and discovers that even attempting to take on this exam is a wasted effort, because the minimum condition to actualize a win con is 15 million private points. It's just not worth the cost, since Ayanokoji's priority is ascertaining an absolute first victory to solidify trust in his class. Ryuen chooses to sink that ship before he can even sail. Ryuen makes the decision to spend all the penalty points on Ayanokoji, preventing him from getting a complete victory, and then randomly selecting some of the worst performing students for the small group battles, which would stop Ayanokoji from predicting any of the participants. Ryuen is using Ayanokoji's position against him to ensure his defeat, and that's why even if he were to lose, he still comes out on top. I gotta give credit where credit is due. Ryuen really impressed me here, and it's easy to understand why Ayanokoji chose him over Sakiyanagi as one of his final opponents. It's just a shame that this is Classroom of the Elite, not Classroom of the Ryuen, because the issue lies with the fact that even when Ryuen pushed his limit to develop such a well thought out action plan, he's still dancing in the palm of Ayanokoji's manipulation game, because Ayanokoji effectively predicts his predictions. Now after the events of the exam play out, of course Ryuen's class loses by a considerable margin, but Ryuen, thinking he took the ultimate victory by jeopardizing Ayanokoji's position as class leader, confidently enters Class C for the quote-unquote winner's interview. But despite his overwhelming failure, he still earned the acknowledgement of his new classmates. Why, you may ask? Well, rather than focusing on his own victory, Ayanokoji prioritized showcasing his absolute strengths to exemplify why he's more than qualified to replace Sakiyanagi. And the reason why is pretty simple. Ayanokoji was the only one in the third year who earned a perfect score on this exam. Now yes, his result was completely cancelled out by Ryuen, using all his penalty points to negate a complete victory, and perhaps if Ayanokoji didn't participate, they could have achieved that result. But the truth is, it's not just the fact that Ayanokoji scored perfectly is the fact that a dangerous guy like Ryuen was completely and utterly focused on the anomaly of Ayanokoji. So even though he couldn't meet those initial expectations for what he was meant to achieve for this exam, he carved his own results that demonstrated even more competence. And this isn't a coincidence either. This happened from the beginning, because Ryuen was constantly falling into his trap. And so this special exam ends with the ultimate victory, not for Ryuen but Ayanokoji. He left his class, made his mark, and now he's officially the head honcho of Class C, with some of the strongest pawns to use at his disposal. Everything is going as planned. Ayanokoji became the class leader. Ichinose defeated Horikita, and Horikita and Ryuen are experiencing diverging pathways of growth. Everything is aligning with Kiyotaka's expectations, but maybe that's the problem, because if things keep playing out this way, then nothing will really change, since his nature is hardwired to these games of manipulation, where every challenge is just another activity to pass time in his madhouse. The Joker will have his fun, and then he will return to the White Room. And maybe if this one moment didn't happen at the end of this volume, I would believe this outcome. I would believe that Ayanokoji is still that same master manipulator he was at the end of the first year island exam. But this one instance, this seemingly insignificant moment, rewrote everything. After all the chaos and his official welcome party into Class C, Ayanokoji walks back to his dorm and he runs into Utamiya and Tsubaki. They have some small talk and Tsubaki questions his antics. You know, pretty standard stuff considering everything that he's done. But he's got stuff to do, so he's about to move on. They walk past each other, and at that moment, Tsubaki directs an intense stare from the corner of her eye. And suddenly, Ayanokoji is hit with a wave of nostalgia. Just a bunch of forgotten memories. Things he's long discarded. Things he stopped considering. But now they all surface to his mind. Ayanokoji then thanks Tsubaki, recalling their conversation at the training camp, where she hinted at having this sibling who was potentially in the White Room. And that lingering question he never answered now has a completely different meaning. Because snow, in Japanese, translates to Yuki. And being consumed by these emotions that he can't understand, he then tells her that he recently thought of someone other than his family that he'd like to meet after he graduates. His childhood friend Yuki, and he says it as more of a wish, a whim, or a hope that if he was a stronger person, maybe things could have been different. But to cope with the pain, he just lies to himself. He tells himself it would be better if they didn't meet, because the reality would not change. And all these thoughts colliding inside are meaningless and pointless matters. This is our unreliable narrator, Kiyotaka Ayanokoji, unable to face his past. Now, this might seem like nothing to you guys, but as someone who spent hours upon hours analyzing and dissecting Ayanokoji, this is the most dramatic character development he's ever experienced. For the first time ever, Ayanokoji is thinking beyond the White Room, and it's the fact that after 2 years in the advanced nurturing high school, Kiyotaka has changed more than I even expected. And perhaps unlike the countless calculations he's accurately made, maybe there's a future out there that he can't predict.